Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for AAC Light-Heavyweight M4 Savage. This is the 4th Savage raid made available in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. My name is Miztech and I'll be your raid guide. Before we begin, assign clock positions, light parties, and partner pairs to all players. There are many mechanics in this fight that will require some variation of these assignments, so we'll use these as default to start and make adjustments as we go along. The encounter begins with Wrath of Zeus, a heavy-hitting raid-wide blast. Shield and heal as necessary. The boss will then grow a set of wings, jump to the north edge of the platform, and begin to cast Bewitching Flight. Electrope clumps will appear on the west edge of the platform that will throw out line attacks across the platform directly in front of them. Players will need to position themselves in the safe lanes between the Electrope to avoid getting blasted. At the same time, the boss's wings will form glowing lasers that will also blast across the platform directly in front of them, creating a crisscross pattern of attack as it overlaps with the Electrope attacks from the side. To avoid getting hit, players must reposition to avoid the laser beams from the wings inside the safe lanes in between the Electrope blasts. The wing laser blast will leave behind purple lines on the platform after that initial blast. The boss will then jump to the center of the room and begin to cast Electrifying Witch Hunt, while more Electrope clumps appear on the east and north edges of the platform. All players will have to find and stand in the safe lanes between the Electrope blasts from the east edge, while also moving away from the north Electrope and corresponding purple lines on the ground that will begin to glow and eventually explode. This can happen either with the center laser lines or the two outer laser lines exploding, and players will need to stay in the center or split into 4 and move to the outer edges. As they reposition to dodge the Electrope and line attacks, they'll need to stay spread from one another. The boss's Electrifying Witch Hunt cast will randomly target all players of the same rule group with a large circle attack that deals high damage and applies physical vulnerability up and forked lightning debuffs. This attack cannot be overlapped or you will die. The forked lightning debuff will last 8 seconds before exploding in a wide circle around that player. Immediately after, the boss will begin to cast Witch Hunt, and the remaining set of ground lines will begin to explode. Move into the center or to the outer edges to avoid getting hit as necessary. As they do so, players will need to look closely at the boss. If you see this purple marker with spaced out diamonds over her, she will target the 4 furthest players from her with Witch Hunt. If you see this pink marker with overlapping diamonds, she will instead target the 4 closest players to her. Since the first role group that got hit by the first Witch Hunt are still debuffed, they will not be able to take another hit, and the remaining players will need to bait the attack instead. The forked lightning debuffs will also be going off at this time, and affected players will need to stay away from others until it resolves. To handle this, once it's identified which group has been hit by the first Witch Hunt, the players of the opposite role group will get ready to bait the second Witch Hunt in the available safe area. If the boss indicates a far bait, the lightning players will stay within the center tiles, while the baiting players move to the outer tiles. This works the same way whether you're dodging in the center or on the 2 edges of the platform. If the boss indicates a near bait, the lightning players will need to move to the far tiles, while the baiting players move to the center tiles to bait. Next up, the boss will cast either Narrowing Witch Hunt or Widening Witch Hunt. 4 sets of diamond markers will also flash over her as she's casting, and players will use these indicators to determine how to appropriately bait the next 4 sets of Witch Hunt attacks. These markers will always alternate in and out, so you really only need to pay attention to that first flash. If the boss is casting Narrowing Witch Hunt, she'll start off by casting a room-wide donut attack, followed by a large circle attack into another donut and 1 more circle attack. If the boss is casting Widening Witch Hunt, she'll instead start with the large circle attack, then the room-wide donut attack into another circle and 1 more donut attack. While these 4 attacks are going off, the boss will also target the 2 closest or furthest players at the time with Witch Hunt, depending on her initial diamond markers. This can get pretty confusing depending on which variation you end up getting, especially if you start to overthink the mechanic, but it's much simpler in practice. To simplify matters, we break the group up into 4 pairs of tanks, healers, melee, and ranged, and make the 2 support groups always bait the first 2 attacks, while the damage dealers will bait the last 2. To accomplish this regardless of which circle or donut pattern is happening, we use positioning based on pairs to minimize brain cell usage. During the first 2 attacks, tanks will stay as close to the boss as they can, while healers stay as far as possible, regardless of the donut or circle pattern. Damage dealers will need to stand in between these 2 extremes to avoid accidentally baiting. For the last 2 attacks, ranged players will stand as far as possible for each attack, while melee stand as close as possible, with the supports in the happy middle between the 2 extremes. Some variations of this attack combo can be slightly more difficult to bait correctly, so be very careful with your positioning to avoid accidental baits. After the 4th attack set, the boss's wings will disappear and she will cast another Wrath of Zeus, shield and heal as necessary. Next, Electrope Edge will spawn 4 clumps of electrode in each of the corner tiles. The boss will then cast Witch Gleam and 3 rounds of laser beams will shoot out from her towards random random Electrope corners. Each hit on Electrope will cause it to explode in a wider area. Players will need to pay close attention here and identify the 2 Electrope corners that have been hit by lasers twice, as these will begin to explode in wide 2x2 tile explosions, when the boss casts Symphonie Fantastique, rendering those entire quadrants unsafe. The boss will then cast Sidewise Spark, and players will have to identify which side of the boss is glowing before moving into the single safe quadrant left over by the overlap of the boss's half-room cleave and the 2 exploding Electrope quadrants. At the same time, the boss will be targeting all players of the same role group with shareable damage, or all players with damage that cannot be overlapped. This is determined by the number of orbs floating around her during her Sidewise Spark cast. If you see 4 large orbs, players will need to stack with their partners in assigned positions within the safe quadrant. If you see 8 smaller orbs, all players will need to spread within the safe quadrant to avoid overlap. Here are the assigned positions for each stack and spread within the safe tile, relative to the boss. All of these mechanics will resolve at the same time. Next up, the boss will target the primary target with Wicked Jolt. This is a 2-part tank buster that will apply a magic vulnerability up debuff with each hit. This will require a tank swap during the cast, and both tanks taking 1 hit with cooldowns, or soloing both hits with an immunity. There are 2 of these tank busters in this phase, and I recommend you use immunities for both, as the cooldowns will be back up by the time you need them in the final phase. To prepare for the incoming mechanic, all players should move to their assigned clock positions at this time. The boss will cast Electrope Edge again, but this time the Electrope will appear around each player, indicated by these short or long debuffs. 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 damage dealers will all share debuff timers, which can apply as a short 22 seconds or a long 42 seconds. Players will need to identify their timer and get ready to watch the boss closely as she begins to cast Witch Gleam again. The boss will begin to shoot 4 rounds of lasers at random towards players, and each player will need to count how many times they get hit by the lasers, as this will determine how wide their Electrope debuff will eventually explode. The number of hits here on each player will determine how they handle the incoming set of mechanics. Players with short timers can be hit either twice or 3 times total. Players with long timers can only be hit once or twice, but since their timer lasts through an extra mechanic that all players will eventually be hit by, long players can actually start counting their laser hits at 1, essentially ending up with a 2 or 3 count as well. Basically, what this boils down to is that in each debuff timer role group, there will be 2 players with 2 laser counts and 2 players with 3 laser counts. The boss will then cast Lightning Cage, and this very specific pattern of AoE telegraphs will appear over the tiles on the platform, essentially limiting the tiles where players can resolve their Electrope debuffs. Overlapping Electrope explosions during this time will deal massive damage and apply bleed debuffs on players, so positioning is very important here. While the orientation may change, the pattern of unsafe tiles will always be the same, so we orient all mechanics relative to this pattern. To handle this first set, all players with long timers will move into the free center tile available on the relative south edge. They must avoid all damage to keep from adding more growth to their Electrope debuffs. The short timer players will then spread to specific tiles based on their laser hit count before their timers run out. Players that were hit by 3 lasers will each move to the open corner tiles on the relative north edge of the platform. Players that were hit by 2 lasers will each move east and west of the boss, standing on these edge tiles. To avoid confusion, we have the damage dealers use the relative west tiles, while the support players use the relative east tiles to resolve their debuffs. After the short set of debuff and tile explosions resolve, the boss will cast Sidewise Spark. Players must first move opposite the glowing side to avoid the half-room cleave. As they do so, identify if it's the stack or spread pattern by looking at the number of glowing orbs around her. If it's spread, players can spread to assigned positions within the safe half of the room, as shown here. If it's partner stack, we have players stack based on their roles and laser hit count to avoid confusion. Support 3s will stack in front of the boss, while support 2s stack behind the boss. Damage dealer 3s will stack in the center of the boss, while damage dealer 2s will stack at max melee on the side of the boss. This ensures all players are sufficiently spread while still allowing for uptime on the boss. The same tile pattern will appear in a random orientation, and the players with long timers will need to resolve their debuff explosions on the appropriate tiles, while the original short debuff players stand in the safe tile in the relative south. This is accomplished in the same manner as the first set of debuff explosions. Next up, Wicked Bolt will target a random healer for stack up. This attack will deal multiple hits of raid-wide damage, and you'll need to stack together with appropriate raid cooldowns, shields, and heals to survive. The boss will then cast Ion Cluster, and players will be afflicted with 3 stacks of a yellow positron or blue negatron debuff. If these stacks are not removed before the timer expires, you will die. The boss will then form an Electrope gun and target 3/4 of the platform with multiple hits of heavy hitting damage that will eventually destroy that section of the platform, leaving one lane safe. All players must move into that safe lane as quickly as possible to avoid excess damage. Once the platform is destroyed, the boss will leap into the center of the remaining lane and begin to cast Electron Stream. The two sides of her gun will glow blue or yellow, and players will need to position themselves on the side opposite to their debuff color. Doing so correctly will negate one stack of their debuff. This blast also deals proximity-based damage, and the two tanks on either side will need to take the brunt of the hit in the front of their group with light cooldowns. There's quite a bit of damage during this time, so healers be ready. Additionally, the Electron Stream Blast will afflict players with one of 4 possible debuffs. These debuffs only last 4 seconds and will resolve immediately, and all players will need to quickly move into position based on their debuff. Since this video is already super long, I won't bother talking about what each debuff does, and instead focus on the positioning to resolve them correctly. Each side will receive one of these purple circle debuffs, and the affected player will need to stand in the center of the tile right on the boss's hitbox. A player on each side will also be afflicted with this tethered debuff, and they'll need to stand directly in front of their purple circle player. The remaining 2 players on each side will have a blue circle debuff that can look like this or like this. These players will position themselves on the outer sides of the platform, close to the center line dividing the 2 sides. To avoid confusion, we have support players move to the left corner, while damage dealers move to the right corner. This positioning will ensure that all debuff effects resolve appropriately, regardless of variation. This mechanic combo will repeat another 2 times, allowing players to negate all stacks of their debuff before they run out of time. Just make sure you're getting hit by the opposite color blast each time, and move into the appropriate position to resolve your debuff immediately after. The platform will reform at this time, and the primary target will be targeted for another Wicked Jolt Tank Buster. Again, I recommend using an immunity to take both hits. At this point, the boss will leap into the center, face south, and begin to cast Electrope Transplant. This begins her transition phase. All players can move close to their assigned intercardinal positions to prepare for the next mechanic. 8 conal attacks will appear around the boss towards each cardinal and intercardinal point that all players will need to avoid. Once this first attack goes off, players will need to move into those areas to avoid the next attack that will occur in the spaces between the cardinal and intercardinal points. This attack will continue to alternate back and forth between these same points, and players will need to dodge each hit as necessary. Around the time of the 4th dodge, all players will need to ensure that they're sufficiently spread, as the boss will soon target all players of the same role group with massive circle attacks that deal high damage and debuffs. The boss will then throw out a massive line attack towards the intercardinals that must be shared by 2 players assigned to that intercardinal. However, because one of these players will be afflicted by the vulnerability up debuff, their unaffected partner will need to take the brunt of the damage by standing in front of them. There will be one last conal attack after this blast, so continue to dodge appropriately. Another round of conal attacks will begin again, and this is handled in the exact same manner as before. After the final conal dodge, the boss will begin to RP, and you'll have a little bit of time to burn her down before she destroys the platform and knocks you backwards onto the next platform. Be careful with your positioning here, as you can get thrown off at the wrong angle to your death if you're not standing in the direct south. The boss will reappear on the north edge of the new platform and will remain stationary for the remainder of the encounter. This final phase begins with Crosstail Switch, multiple raid-wide blasts that will deal high damage with each hit. Assign appropriate raid cooldowns and shield and heal as necessary. This is immediately followed by the appearance of multiple directional arrow AoE circles all over the platform. The 2 healers will also be targeted by these stack-up markers, and the raid will need to split into light parties. Each group will move together to the east and west edges of the platform, in between the center circle telegraphs. Once there, they'll look at the telegraphs on the opposite edge and find the one telegraph that is pointing outwards. This lane will be the safe lane that they will need to move into once the mechanic begins to resolve. As soon as the first set of circle explosions go off and they begin to move, each group will adjust into their appropriate safe lane, making sure to stay closely stacked together to share the multiple hits of shareable damage on their healer. The boss will then cast Wicked Special, and players will need to look at the boss to determine which variation is incoming. If the boss's sword is a flame, players will need to move out of the center to avoid getting hit. This attack is 2 tiles wide, so make sure you're far enough away. If the boss's arms are glowing blue, players will need to move into the center to avoid the incoming 2 attacks on each side of the platform. Next up, 2 passable tethers will appear on random players that should be picked up by each tank. To ensure easy pickup, players can stack in the center with the tanks in front of them. The tanks will then spread the tethers away from others and take the incoming hit with cooldowns. All other players will also need to spread, ideally within their own tile, to ensure they're not overlapping. The boss will target 4 random non-tanks with large circle attacks that deal high damage and apply fire resist down 2 debuffs that persist for some time. The 2 tanks will also be afflicted with a 9-second mustard bomb that will explode at the end of its duration. Since the tanks are also afflicted by fire resist down debuffs, they won't be able to survive this secondary explosion, and the 2 players that were not targeted by the initial attack will have to run in to grab the debuff off of them. To avoid confusion, we have the undebuffed players move to the tank closest to them, and then move to the the north edge to take the final explosion while everyone else ensures they're far enough away to avoid getting hit. Next up, the boss will cast Ethereal Conversion, and her tail tentacles will begin to glow either blue or red in succession. The side that the glow begins on indicates the side the respective mechanic will begin on. If you see blue, the boss will knock back all players from the glowing red dot on the platform, and players will need to move to the appropriate side and pre-position next to that red dot to avoid getting knocked off the platform. Once the first knockback goes off, they'll need to quickly reposition next to the other red dot to resolve the second knockback. If you see red, the boss will target the glowing red dots with an absolutely massive circle attack. Players will have to pre-position on the opposite side of the platform to wait out the attack before quickly repositioning to the other side to avoid the second hit. Next, the raid can stack in the center of the arena to prepare for the next mechanic combo. The boss will cast Azure Thunder, dealing high raid-wide damage. Use raid cooldowns, shield, and heal as necessary. This is followed by Twilight Sabbath. The arena's safe area will be limited during this time, and 4 circles will begin to float down towards the platform, slowly revealing adds within them that will each be casting sidewise spark in a random direction. 2 of the circles are lower and will hit the ground faster. At the same time, the boss is casting Wicked Fire, targeting the ground under all players with very wide circle AoE attacks. To handle this, all players will remain stacked in the center as they wait for the adds to be revealed. They'll be able to determine the safe quadrant formed by the 2 overlapping sidewise sparks at the same time that the circle attacks appear underneath them. Quickly move into the safe quadrant to avoid getting hit. Once this first set of clone attacks go off, players can look at the remaining 2 clones to determine the next safe quadrant before quickly moving into it. At the same time, the boss will cast Wicked Special, and players must identify if they'll need to move to the center or to the outside within the available safe quadrant to avoid getting hit by the overlapping attack. Next, the boss will cast Midnight Sabbath, and 8 circles will begin floating towards the platform. 4 of these circles, either on all cardinals or intercardinals, will land first. The adds within the first set of circles will determine the movement required by each partner pair. Each partner pair will be assigned to 2 adds, one at a cardinal and intercardinal, and they'll handle movement relative to these 2 adds only. If the first set of adds has wings, they'll cast donut attacks around them, and players will move into their assigned adds to avoid getting hit. If the first set of adds has the big gun, they will blast line attacks across the platform directly in front of them, and players will need to move to their other assigned add next to them. At the same time, the boss will be casting either Scattered Burst or Concentrated Burst. If it's scattered, all players must spread within their assigned safe areas. If it's concentrated, each partner pair will stack together within their assigned safe area. Immediately after, the second set of circle adds will appear, and their respective attacks will go off. Players will need to either move to the second set of adds or stay on their initial add depending on the second add's appearance. As they do so, they will need to stack or spread again, whichever of the 2 didn't occur the first time. The boss will begin casting Wicked Special as the second set of adds resolve, and all players will need to identify the variation by looking at the boss and dodging appropriately. The platform will return to normal, and the boss will cast Wicked Thunder, dealing more raid-wide damage. Use cooldowns, heals, and shields. The boss will then cast another Ethereal Conversion, and players will need to identify the type of cast and which side it's starting from. This mechanic will be stored for later use, so make sure you remember what was cast. Next, Flame Slash will destroy the center of the platform, and the raid will need to split into assigned light parties and move to the 2 outer edges. 4 raining sword soak towers will appear on each edge, and all 4 must be soaked by a player or they will explode and you will probably die. 4 swords will appear in these areas, and the boss will begin to cast Chain Lightning. These purple arrow lines will target 3 of the 4 swords on each edge before bouncing to the other side. This will occur 4 times in a row, with a specific sword staying safe each round. On each side, this results in a random sequence of safe swords that players must identify and memorize. I like to say the sequence out loud as it appears to help me remember it, or you can type out the pattern in Say Chat for reference. Once Chain Lightning begins, players will need to align themselves on the inner edge of the platform in line with the safe sword to avoid the very wide incoming circle blasts on the affected swords. After the first circle blasts, players will need to reposition to the next safe sword, and so on until all 4 sets of Chain Lightning attacks go off. After the final Chain Lightning attack goes off, the platform returns to normal and the boss begins to cast Tail Thrust. The previous Ethereal Conversion mechanic that was stored will now come into play. Dodge or pre-position appropriately based on the incoming attack and the side it's starting on. Another Mustard Bomb will occur and the two tanks will pick up the tethers to take each hit with cooldowns, while everyone else spreads to avoid overlap. To make things easier for everyone, we have the tanks keep the mustard bombs this time and use their immunities to survive the secondary blasts. The boss will cast Ethereal Conversion again, and players will once again need to identify the type of cast and what side it's starting from for later. The boss will cast another Azure Thunder, dealing more raid-wide damage. Healers be ready. Next up, Ion Cluster will afflict all players with a single stack of blue Negatron or yellow Positron debuffs. 4 players will have short debuffs, and 4 players will have long debuffs, 23 and 38 seconds respectively. The color of these debuffs and their timers will affect how players handle the next round of mechanics. The boss will cast Sunrise Sabbath, and 6 circle adds will spawn. The adds with guns will turn towards the player closest to them, blasting massive line attacks in that direction. The adds with wings will either face straight east and west, or be slightly turned towards the north or south. The direction that these adds are facing indicate where 2-person soak towers will soon appear. The players with the long debuff timers will be responsible for soaking this first set of towers. Of the remaining 4 adds with guns, 2 will be shooting blue, while the other 2 are shooting yellow. Players with the short debuffs will need to stand near an add of the opposite color, baiting their respective blasts away from the soak towers. To avoid confusion here, we assign a priority to each player so that everyone is on the same page about which add is theirs to bait, based on their color. After the first round of add mechanics, the boss will cast Wicked Special, and all players will need to identify which variation is incoming and dodge appropriately. Immediately after, the adds will begin their second round of attacks. The initial short timer players will now move in to soak the towers, while the players with the long debuffs will need to bait the gun blasts away from the tower soak locations. Once this second round of add mechanics resolves, the boss will cast Tail Thrust. That previous Ethereal Conversion attack will begin to resolve, and players will need to handle this as necessary. Next up, the boss will cast Sword Quiver, slashing across the platform 4 times, dealing raid-wide damage with each hit. These slashes will persist on the platform and soon explode in wider line attacks, forming small safe areas in between the overlapping lines. All players of the same role group will also be targeted by shareable damage, and partner pairs will need to dodge into the available safe spots together. The first 3 slashes will always form the same star pattern, while the final slash will vary with each cast. This final slash can occur north, south, or straight through the middle, limiting the available safe zones. Using the center 4th slash as the default, player pairs can move into these respective safe zones like so. They can then keep these same relative positions for the other variations of safe zones as necessary. The boss will cast Sword Quiver 3 times in a row before one final Wicked Thunder hard enrage. You'll need to destroy her before this cast goes off, or you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I'll see you back here in 7.1. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.